I have always thought there is something peculiarly desolate about Walton Street when the rain falls without interruption, as if the stones themselves are rehearsing a funeral march. The buses crawl past with a weary hiss. Bicycles lean abandoned against railings, their wheels twitching faintly as though they shivered in the damp air. I walked that way often enough in those years, not out of any affection for the district, but because habit had the better of me. And habits once acquired are rarely shaken free. The Jericho pubs offered a kind of sanctuary, though sanctuary is not quite the word, for there was never solace to be found there, only the muffled company of strangers and the occasional flicker of a smile across the bar. I would step inside more for the silence than for the noise, if you understand me, for the way silence can stretch between half-empty glasses and stale tobacco and remind a man of what he has misplaced in life. That evening the rain had begun as a fine mist around 5 and thickened steadily until it lay like an iron curtain over the rooftops. I remember brushing the water from my coat sleeve as I settled myself at a corner table, my pint reflecting the overhead light in a dull halo. The place was nearly deserted, save for a barmaid polishing glasses without enthusiasm and an elderly couple bent together over a crossword. I glanced once at their puzzle, noting with quiet approval that the old fellow had filled in Tennyson where the clue had clearly demanded Browning. Such errors, casual to most, rarely escaped my notice. It was then I saw the newspaper, folded carelessly as if discarded after the smallest of duties, some local sheet, provincial in its layout and thin on substance. Yet one column caught me, a small obituary being the sort that most eyes would skim and forget. Dr. Adrian Felstead, it read, formerly of Lonsdale College, had died suddenly in Jericho, collapsing in a tavern late on Tuesday evening. The language was sober, almost brusque, no mournful adjectives, no list of achievements, no family tribute. Only that barest of facts, he had ordered his last pint and never lifted it. I had known Felstead, though only in the most fleeting manner. A man who had once held forth at some dreary academic dinner on the matter of Latin metrics, his voice smooth yet brittle, as though each word had to fight for breath. He had the sort of face one forgets instantly, and yet in that instant, at the pub, I remembered him vividly. He had worn his disappointments like a second waistcoat, buttoned tight across the chest. Lewis, when I mentioned it later, dismissed it with the practical certainty of a policeman too long acquainted with the mundane causes of death. Heart failure, perhaps, or the cumulative despair of age, nothing suspicious, but I could not reconcile myself to the image of the untouched pint, the glass left waiting in the corner of a Jericho barroom. A man does not order a drink in such weather, after such a life, merely to let it rest. I stayed longer than I had intended, my eyes drifting back to the crossword. The couple had gone, leaving behind their penciled mistakes and abandoned clues. One caught me. Cup that cannot be emptied, 5 letters. I felt the faint stir of recognition, but let it lie, content for the moment in the knowledge that puzzles often solve themselves at the least expected hour. When I stepped outside at last, Walton Street was shining with rain, every cobblestone a darkened mirror. The night buses still rumbled by, and the faint chime of a church clock carried on the wind. I lit a cigarette under the narrow awning of the tavern and thought of Felstead, of the pint he never raised, of the silence he had left behind him. There are silences that press like accusations, and that night, though I could not have said why, I felt the first shadow of an accusation fall across me too. Lewis never did care much for pubs unless the football was showing, and even then he preferred them noisy and well-lit, places where the pint arrived frothing, and the conversation needed no interpretation. Yet he followed me that morning without complaint, rain still stitched across the pavements, the gutters carrying yesterday's sorrows down towards the canal. The old Jericho tavern looked as it always did, a low building with windows filmed in condensation, the smell of wood polish and spilled beer clinging to the doorway like the memory of every conversation that had ever failed to reach a conclusion. Inside there was the usual melancholy of daylight in a drinking house. Chairs upturned on tables in one corner, the fruit machine unplugged, silence broken only by the occasional rattle of a teaspoon in a saucer. The barmaid, a pale young woman with tired eyes, glanced up as if she recognized in us not the promise of company but the certainty of questions. She told it in fragments, almost unwillingly. The professor had sat by himself, as was his habit. He had ordered a pint, bitter, though he had hardly touched it. He had spoken only once, leaning towards her as she collected empties from a nearby table. I never could finish what was started in the cloisters. She had not known what it meant, had smiled awkwardly, and moved away. Moments later, he was slumped forward, his hand resting not on the glass, but on the sleeve of his coat. Lewis muttered that it sounded plain enough. Old fellow, weak heart, too much strain. He said it in the tone of one who has closed a file in his mind before it is opened. But I kept staring at the glass, its surface still faintly misted. An untouched pint in a Jericho pub, a contradiction in terms. There are details that whisper louder than testimony, and that glass whispered to me, not because it was full, but because it was there at all. Why order a drink one has no intention of drinking? A gesture, perhaps, or a signal to someone else? The barmaid shifted uneasily under my silence, and I asked her if the professor had spoken with anyone. She shook her head. Only the remark about cloisters, and then the collapse. Her eyes flicked towards the snug, as though memory had taken her there unbidden. I followed the look, but found only polished tables, a forgotten scarf draped across a chair. Lewis asked about relatives, friends, anyone to call. She said there had been none, not that she knew of. A solitary man, always courteous, always precise. He would sometimes correct her grammar, though kindly. Once he had brought her a volume of verse, explaining that the poet had captured the very smell of rain on stone. She had not read it. Back outside, Lewis lit a cigarette and declared that we had wasted our time. But the words stayed with me, those cloisters. In Oxford, there are too many cloisters to count, each echoing with footsteps of ambition and regret. Yet his phrasing was not casual. I never could finish what was started in the cloisters. It had the cadence of confession. I thought of the crossword clue from the night before, the cup that cannot be emptied, a coincidence perhaps, or perhaps not. For what is a pint untouched if not a cup that refuses to be emptied, a riddle left unfinished? We walked back towards the station slowly, the city just beginning to stir, students hurrying under umbrellas, the faint sound of a choir warming up somewhere behind ancient walls. Lewis talked of traffic reports and timetables. I let him talk. My mind was elsewhere, circling the image of a man who had ordered one last pint and left it standing like an accusation against the world. The dead, I have often thought, cast longer shadows than the living. It is not merely memory that extends them, but the questions left unanswered, the debts unsettled, the faint impression of a voice fading before the sentence is complete. So it was with Adrian Felstead, a man who, in life, had passed through Oxford's cloisters half forgotten, yet in death seemed to draw towards himself the half-buried resentments of others. We began, as one must, with those nearest to him, though nearest was a word to be used loosely. Felstead had not been a man of intimacy. Still there were names to trace. Gardiner, Clara Henslow, Simon Rook, Eleanor Venn. Each figure hovered at the edges of his existence, none admitting to more than acquaintance, yet each with an air of words unsaid. Gardener first. Professor of medieval literature, still ensconced in his rooms at Lonsdale, surrounded by manuscripts and the faint perfume of academic vanity. He greeted us with courtesy, though there was a brittle laughter in his manner, as though everything were an anecdote to be dismissed with irony. When I spoke Felstead's name, he paused, too briefly, and replied that his colleague had been brilliant once, but prone to paranoia, forever imagining slights. His eyes strayed not to me, but to a shelf where the spines of Latin texts stood like sentinels. I noticed one volume placed upside down, a careless act in a room otherwise composed to perfection. Clara Henslow next, widow of a Don, still elegant despite the quiet erosion of years. She lived alone in a house near the Banbury Road, curtains drawn though it was not yet evening. She received us in a room perfumed faintly with lavender, her tone poised, her sentences coolly measured. She spoke of Felstead's charm, his melancholy, the way he seemed always to be carrying a disappointment too heavy for him. But she denied any closeness, and as she spoke, she quoted a line of poetry. "Tennyson," she said, except it was Browning. A slip, perhaps, or perhaps the kind of misquotation that betrays an intimacy never meant for disclosure. Simon Rook, the former pupil, was of another kind, a man who had traded his promise for ink-stained evenings in second-rate newsrooms, nursing bitterness as if it were his only possession. He met us in a pub off George Street, words spilling too quickly, too rehearsed. He insisted Felstead had been wronged by the university, that Gardner had stolen from him, that Clara had deceived him. His voice carried the desperation of one who needs his stories to be believed. And yet in his telling I noticed a curious omission. He repeated several phrases, circling back like a man retracing footsteps in the dark. But when he came to the night of Felstead's death, he skipped over a detail and never returned. I could not then name what was missing, but the absence gnawed at me. And finally Eleanor Venn, landlady of the old Jericho tavern. She knew him in the way only those behind a bar know their regulars. His hours, his drinks, the way he folded his newspaper twice before beginning the crossword. She spoke without ornament, her voice low, as though the walls might overhear. Felstead had been kind, she said, though distracted. He would sometimes pause mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. That last evening, she believed he had come with a purpose, though she could not say what. When I asked her why, she glanced towards the snug, then back at me, and answered that there was something in his face, not resignation but expectation. Expectation. The word lingered in my mind long after we left. Each of them, I felt, had expected something of Felstead, and each had been left unsatisfied. Gardiner sought vindication, Clara discretion, Simon revenge, Eleanor perhaps only truth. And Felstead himself, a man expecting an ending, and finding it in a pint he never touched. The dead man's flat was a first-floor affair in North Oxford, the kind of rented accommodation that carries with it the faint smell of damp carpets and old varnish. The curtains had been half drawn, shutting out the thin daylight as though secrecy might be preserved by darkness. Lewis went first, heavy-footed as ever, his pen already poised for the simple details that never satisfied me. It was not a large room, nor was it untidy. Books along the walls, their spines bearing the marks of repeated use. A writing desk, pushed. Against the window, its surface scattered with letters, a pair of spectacles, and a crossword folded neatly in half. I moved towards it with the same compulsion one feels in churches when faced with an open hymnal, the instinct to read the words left by someone who can no longer sing them. The crossword had been abandoned midway, Several clues correctly solved, others scribbled faintly in pencil, then rubbed out. One entry lingered in my mind. Cup that cannot be emptied, 5 letters. He had written Grail and then, uncertain, erased it. I traced the faint outline of the vanished word with my finger. Why strike it out? The answer had been right, or almost right. Yet perhaps that had been the trouble. An answer too obvious, too final, would not have pleased Felstead. He was the kind of man who preferred puzzles to remain puzzles. Lewis called my attention to the desk drawer. Inside we found a diary. I turned the pages slowly, the paper faintly crackling, and discovered that March was missing entirely. Torn out, not absent by accident, but carefully excised. What had those weeks contained that he or someone else had sought to erase? I could not know. And yet the violence of absence often tells more than presence. Among the papers was a letter, unopened. The postmark bore the word Venice. The address was written in a hand neither hurried nor careless, a hand that belonged to someone who had written him before. I considered opening it there, but something restrained me. Letters unopened are a form of testimony, their silence often louder than their contents. I placed it aside, noting only that he had not chosen to read it before ordering that final pint. Lewis busied himself with practicalities, electricity bills, bank statements, the dull weight of living reduced to numbers. He muttered that nothing suggested foul play, only solitude. Yet I kept circling back to the crossword, the half-erased words, the deliberate hesitation, the restless pencil. It was as though the man had been leaving behind an unfinished conversation with himself. On the wall above the desk hung a framed photograph, black and white, slightly faded. A group of scholars robed, standing in a cloister. I recognized Felstead at the edge, younger, his face tense, even in youth. Beside him stood Gardner, unmistakable with his sharp nose and self-assured posture. Between them, an empty space where someone else might once have been. My eyes lingered there, on that blank gap between two men who had since become adversaries. The absence in the photograph echoed the absence in the diary, and for a moment I felt I was seeing a pattern too subtle for words. Lewis asked if I had noticed the damp ring on the table beside the crossword. He said it looked like a coffee stain, but I could tell it was the ring left by a wine glass long since removed. Felstead had drunk alone then before turning to his puzzle. Bitter in the pub, wine at home. 2 unfinished cups in 2 different rooms. I wondered if the man had been living his life as a succession of unfinished drafts. We left the flat as evening pressed itself upon Oxford. The rain had returned, tapping faintly against the window panes as I pulled the door closed. I carried the image of that crossword with me. The faint erasure, the wrong answer, the hesitation in the pencil strokes. It seemed to me then that the puzzle had not been abandoned at all, but rather left open, waiting for a reader who might understand that sometimes the right answer is precisely the one that must be rubbed away. The corridors of Lonsdale always struck me as too carefully polished, as if the college were determined to outshine the memory of the scholars who had passed through them. The floors gleamed like mirrors, but the walls still smelled faintly of old paper and extinguished fires. It was here, among cloisters that had held centuries of secrets, that I found Gardner once more. He received me in his rooms with an air of irritation disguised as courtesy. Books everywhere, of course. Calf-bound volumes stacked neatly, though a few betrayed the impatience of recent use. On his desk lay a Latin text opened at the middle, a translation half-copied on a legal pad beside it. He gestured for me to sit, though the gesture lacked warmth. Felstead had been a man of promise, Gardner began, but his paranoia had consumed him. He had believed that colleagues, rivals, even friends, were conspiring to rob him of his work. Gardner smiled thinly, adding that Felstead had been particularly obsessed with a medieval poem whose authorship was still debated. I asked him what the poem was about. He answered with a wave of the hand, love, betrayal, the usual nonsense. His voice was dismissive, but the corner of his eye twitched when I pressed him on details. There is a way men lie not by invention, but by omission, and Gardner was such a man. He spoke of Felstead as though he were already an irrelevance, a footnote in a larger text. Yet when he quoted a line from the disputed poem, he faltered. He attributed it to Virgil when it was in truth from Propertius, the kind of slip no scholar of his calibre should make. And I wondered then whether Gardner, like Clara Henslow, had cultivated the art of misquotation. Perhaps accident, perhaps not. When I mentioned Clara by name, he gave a short laugh. She had, he said, been a distraction to Felstead. A widow with too much time, too much elegance, and too much appetite for attention. She had encouraged him, perhaps even entangled him, but nothing of substance had ever passed between them. I said nothing, only watched him fidget with the stem of his wine glass. As I rose to leave, Gardner added, almost casually, that Felstead had once accused him of theft, of stealing a translation Felstead himself had abandoned. Gardner claimed he had dismissed the accusation as nonsense, but there was a tremor in the claim, the faintest bitterness, as if the word theft had settled too deeply into him ever to be erased. Outside, the air in the quadrangle smelled of wet stone. The choir rehearsed somewhere, their voices carrying through the arches in broken fragments. I thought of Clara Henslow then, and went to see her. Her house near Banbury Road was a study in restraint. Muted curtains, pale carpets, a faint trace of lavender. She welcomed me with composure, as though expecting me all along. Felstead had been a man of sadness, she told me. Charming, but weighted with an unspoken burden. He had visited her often enough, but never with the air of romance. Friendship, she insisted, nothing more. Her words were precise, her posture unyielding. Yet when she spoke of him, her eyes did not quite meet mine. It was then she recited a line of verse to illustrate something about his melancholy. She attributed it to Tennyson, yet I recognized Browning, unmistakably Browning. I did not correct her. Instead, I let the silence deepen. There are misquotations that arise from ignorance, and there are those that arise from memory too keen to admit its source. I felt hers was the latter. As I walked back towards the city, rain beginning to pepper the pavements once more, I turned over these whispered translations, Gardner's slip from Propertius to Virgil, Clara's slide from Browning to Tennyson, both scholars in their ways, yet both concealing something behind borrowed lines. Felstead had lived among such concealments, half-truths, and unfinished poems. Perhaps his life, like his crossword, had been nothing more than a translation left suspended between tongues, unfinished, uncertain, erased before the final word. The letter lay on my desk for some hours before I summoned the will to open it. There are moments when one hesitates not out of respect, but out of fear that the words inside will rearrange the world into something darker. The envelope was cream, thick, and bore the faint perfume of travel. Venezia, the postmark read. The script was elegant, almost ornamental, the kind of hand that belonged to someone who cared as much about form as about meaning. Lewis had brought it to me in a brown evidence folder, his expression matter of fact. He said we'd better translate it quickly and decide whether it meant anything at all. To him it was merely a foreign import, a distraction from the plain certainties of cause and effect. He asked if I knew Italian. Enough, I answered, though I was not certain. Enough at least to hear the music behind the words. The letter began not with a greeting, but with a fragment of verse, lines that spoke of wine poured but never drunk, of a mask removed too late, of betrayal carried on a tide of bells. I read them aloud softly, half to myself. Lewis frowned, said it sounded like nonsense, but I recognized in those phrases an echo of a medieval poem Felstead had once spoken of at a dinner I could barely remember. The same words, reshaped, translated again through time. The writer signed only with an initial. It might have been a C, or it might have been an O. The ink had bled slightly into the paper, as if blurred by rain or tears. I traced it with my finger, and wondered if Felstead had done the same. Had he read these words, or had he left the letter sealed deliberately, afraid of what they might reopen? Lewis muttered that it was probably from an old flame. He said it with a shrug, as if all such flames burned down to ashes harmlessly. But I could not forget Clara Henslow's misquotation of Browning, her eyes lowering when Felstead's name passed between us. Venice, Browning, betrayal. The pattern flickered like a half-lit lamp. I went to the Bodleian that afternoon, the rain still threatening but holding itself in check. In the Radcliffe camera, I pulled down a copy of a Venetian anthology of poetry, 17th century, its pages still faintly smelling of dust and ink. I found the lines echoed almost verbatim, not a translation, but an adaptation, deliberate, careful. Felstead had been working with this text, perhaps obsessed by it. And the letter suggested someone else, someone in Venice, had known of his work intimately enough to echo it back to him in their own hand. What struck me most, however, was the choice of words, one phrase in particular, the mask removed too late. It reminded me of a crossword clue Felstead had half completed, a disguise, 5 letters. He had written MASK, then erased it. Why erase such a simple truth? Unless the mask had been his own, and he had grown tired of seeing it on paper. I walked back through the wet streets, passing St. Giles, the bells striking the hour faintly above me. I thought of Felstead, a man in retreat, suddenly confronted by a letter from Venice that spoke not only of literature but of memory. Was it Clara who had written? Or another, perhaps a former pupil, a confidant, and someone whose absence explained the torn-out pages of March? At home that night, I poured myself a whisky and left it on the table beside me, untouched, as if to mirror his pint. The glass caught the lamplight, but held no comfort. I read the letter again and again until the words blurred, and in the blur I saw him, hunched in the Jericho tavern, whispering his last line about the cloisters. The unopened envelope had been the truest clue of all. For sometimes what a man chooses not to read speaks more loudly than what he does. And I could not shake the thought that Felstead had been waiting, not for death, but for a reply that never came. It was Lewis who suggested we try the pub on George Street, though it was not the sort of place I favoured. The lighting too harsh, the beer too cold, the chatter too empty of anything that might resemble thought. Yet it was there, amid the clatter of fruit machines and the smell of frying oil, that Simon Rook held court like a minor prophet ignored by his flock. He was already half a pint ahead of us, his words tumbling with the speed of a man afraid of silence. Felstead had been on the brink of revelation, he said, a great betrayal at the heart of the college, a scandal ripe for exposure, and he, Rook, had known it all along. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a whisper, thick with ale. A scoop, he called it, his big chance. Lewis looked unimpressed. Blackmail, he muttered under his breath. But I was not so certain. Rook was too clumsy for blackmail. He lacked the patience for silence, the subtlety for waiting. He wanted recognition, not money. His story was performance, not strategy. And yet, amid his boasting, I noticed a hesitation. He repeated certain phrases like a man rehearsing a script: Gardener's theft, Clara's vanity, Felstead's paranoia. Each time the words returned to the same shape, as though he needed the rhythm to keep from collapsing. But when he described the night of Felstead's death, his language faltered. He said Felstead had left his pint untouched, had muttered something about cloisters, and then he stopped. No detail about the collapse, no mention of the ambulance, no description of the barmaid's panic. He skipped directly to the aftermath, to his own theories. It was as if he had rehearsed everything except the moment of death. I asked him where he had been sitting. He waved his hand vaguely somewhere by the door, but Eleanor Venn had not mentioned him at all. Had she failed to notice him, or had he not been there until after? Rook laughed too loudly then, insisting that Gardner had blood on his hands, that Clara was hiding a secret in her quiet house. His finger jabbed the air as if assigning guilt were enough to prove it. Lewis grew impatient, reminding him that idle talk could have consequences, but Rook only shrugged, swallowed the rest of his pint, and ordered another with money that looked too crumpled, too scarce. It was not his words that lingered with me, but his silences, the way he leapt over the crucial moment as if it were a stone in the path he dared not tread upon. The omission told me more than all his accusations. Felstead's death had been the one event Rook could not shape into story, and so he left it unsaid. Back outside, the night air was heavy with the smell of wet tarmac. The city thrummed with its usual restlessness, students laughing too loudly, buses sighing at stops, the faint echo of a saxophone from a distant corner. Lewis said he was convinced Rook had tried to blackmail Felstead, and failed. I nodded but said nothing. What struck me was not the attempt at blackmail, but the absence of detail in a man who traded in detail, a journalist who could describe Clara's perfume and Gardiner's temper, but could not speak of a man dying 2 feet away. As we walked back towards the station, I thought again of the crossword, a clue unfinished, a word erased, a silence where there should have been certainty. Rook's story had the same shape. It was not the answers that mattered, but the gaps between them, and in those gaps, I felt, the truth was quietly waiting. The business of wills has always seemed to me less about inheritance than about confession. A man's last words, shaped not in breath but in ink, reveal more than his life ever dared to. So it was with Felstead. Among the papers retrieved from his solicitor, there emerged a will curiously austere. No property, no fortune to divide. Only a few modest bequests, a wristwatch to a nephew long estranged, a handful of books to the Bodleian, and, most strangely, a single volume of poetry left to Clara Henslow. It was the detail that Lewis read aloud with the greatest indifference, and the one that struck me like a chord struck too hard. Why Clara? Why this book? We called on her again. She received us with the same composure as before, her rooms as faintly scented, her curtains half drawn against the world. When I asked about the book, she nodded without hesitation, as though she had been expecting the question. Yes, she had known about it. Felstead had mentioned once that he wished her to keep a particular edition. She spoke the words with such evenness that they might have been rehearsed. The solicitor delivered the volume to me directly, a worn collection of English verse, its binding frayed, its pages annotated in a hand, both cramped and precise. When I turned to the flyleaf, I saw faint traces of erasure, a dedication, scratched out, then overwritten. The ghost of another name beneath hers, letters just visible if the light struck at the right angle. A woman's name, I thought, not Clara's. Perhaps not meant for her at all. I asked if she had ever received poetry from Felstead before. She smiled then, though it was the kind of smile that closes rather than opens a conversation. He had spoken often of verse, she admitted, but never in a way that suggested gift or intimacy. Her tone was steady, but her hands betrayed her. Fingers pressed together too tightly, then released too quickly. Lewis shifted in his chair, sensing only the dull air of impropriety. I sensed something else, a deliberate concealment. For why would a man alter a dedication if not to disguise its true recipient? And why then insist upon giving the altered book to Clara, as if drawing her into a secret she had no wish to keep? When we left, Lewis muttered that it all seemed clear enough. Clara had been closer to Felstead than she cared to admit, and the book was his belated token. But clarity rarely satisfies me. Too neat, too rehearsed. It felt as if someone had arranged the scene for my inspection, a red herring left gleaming in the shallow water. That night, alone in my rooms, I opened the book again. The annotations led me to one poem in particular, a meditation on betrayal and the permanence of words once written, margins crowded with notes, lines underlined with a fervour that bordered on obsession, and there, at the bottom of the page, a single word written in capitals, M-A-S-K-E. It echoed in my mind, linking itself with the crossword Felstead had left unfinished, the erased clue, the Venetian letter. A mask removed too late, a disguise acknowledged, then rubbed out. Always the same pattern. Words half written, half erased, as though Felstead had been trying to bury something in the very act of writing it down. I closed the book, its smell of dust and old leather filling the room. Somewhere outside, the bells marked the hour. I thought of Clara then, her poised smile, her misquoted Browning, the faint pressure of her fingers. Widowhood had left her with silence, and perhaps Felstead had offered her nothing more than another silence to guard. But I could not rid myself of the suspicion that the book was not meant for her at all, that she, too, had inherited not a gift, but a burden. There is a kind of silence peculiar to taverns once emptied of their chatter. Not the silence of solitude, but the residue of voices clinging to the woodwork, as if each word once spoken had soaked into the grain of the bar and would never quite leave. It was in that silence I found Eleanor Venn again. The old Jericho tavern was closed, its chairs stacked on tables, the air still faintly bitter with hops and smoke. She moved between the tables slowly, polishing without need, as though ritual might hold back memory. I asked her about Felstead's last night. She looked at me for a long time before answering, her rag twisting between her hands. He had not been drunk, she said, nor had he seemed ill. He had been waiting. For what, she could not say, but she had seen him glance often towards the snug, as though expecting someone. And then Gardiner had arrived. Her voice dropped lower. They had spoken quietly, not the quarrel of men raising their voices, but the brittle exchange of men concealing anger in courtesy. She had caught only one word clearly poison. After that the voices fell again into murmur, and soon enough Gardiner had left, his expression composed, but his step too quick. When I later asked Gardiner about this, he shrugged. "Nonsense," he said. They had spoken only of trivialities, the weather, the endless college meetings. He had never uttered the word poison. He smiled thinly when I pressed him, as though amused by my credulity. But Eleanor's account lingered with me. She had no reason to invent such a word, no advantage to gain by placing it between them. Lewis said the landlady must have misheard, a word like portion perhaps, or passion. Misheard words are as common as spilled beer. Yet I could not let it go. The word poison, once spoken, cannot be unheard. I turned my attention again to the glass. It was still there, Eleanor told me, though she had washed it many times since. A plain pint glass, one among dozens, yet she swore she had never served it again, as if the faint shadow of Felstead's lips remained on the rim. She showed it to me reluctantly, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the bar. The glass was ordinary in every respect. No cracks, no stains. And yet, as I held it up to the light, I noticed something, the faintest residue, not at the bottom where one might expect, but high on the inside rim, a ring too faint to be seen easily, perhaps nothing more than detergent not fully rinsed. Yet the image clung to me, the mark of a drink never taken, the ghost of an unfinished act. I asked Eleanor again why she had kept it. She hesitated, then said it felt wrong to throw it with the rest. Wrong, she repeated, as though the word itself were fragile. She looked at me then with sudden clarity. He was afraid that night. Not ill, not weary, but afraid. I walked out into the evening, the tavern behind me shuttered against the damp. The rain had begun again, tapping at the windows of Jericho like a persistent question. I thought of the crossword once more, the cup that cannot be emptied. A pint, ordered, untouched, left behind, not emptied because it had never been raised. Silence is not absence, it is presence withheld. The silence in the tavern spoke louder than Gardner's protestations, louder than Rook's boasting, louder even than Clara's measured denials. It told me that Felstead had waited, and in waiting he had left behind a message no less deliberate than the erased words in his diary or the scratched-out dedication in his book. Lewis walked beside me, muttering about the impossibility of chasing words half-heard and glasses half-drained. I let him speak. In truth, I could not yet say what it meant either, but I knew this. The tavern's silence was not empty. It was full of fear, of expectation, of a truth still cloaked, waiting for someone patient enough to hear it. The cloisters of Lonsdale had always seemed to me a theatre of half-truths. Their stone arches, cool even in summer, carried echoes too faint to distinguish. Footsteps from centuries past, fragments of arguments, murmured confessions. When Eleanor had repeated that single word, poison, it was here my thoughts returned, for cloisters hold more secrets than libraries ever confess. I walked the quadrangle alone that evening. Rain had washed the flagstones clean, and the lamps along the walls glistened faintly, their glow blurred in the puddles. My coat collar turned against the drizzle. I thought of Felstead's last words. I never could finish what was started in the cloisters. He had not meant the beer, nor even his work. It was this place, these stones, this unfinished matter. The college archives smelled of damp parchment and candle smoke long extinguished. Lewis trailed me reluctantly, his pencil tapping against his notebook. I asked the archivist for records of disputed manuscripts, years back, decades even. The woman produced a catalogue, pages brittle with age, and left us to the silence of dust and ink. It did not take long to find his name. Adrian Felstead, credited once for the discovery of a misattributed medieval text. A Venetian poem wrongly ascribed, then quietly corrected, the credit shifting from him to Gardner within the space of a year. The record was bland, but the subtext sharp. A man's triumph withdrawn, another's reputation polished. I traced my finger along the entry, the handwriting elegant, yet altered at one point. The ink darker, fresher. Gardner's name inserted later, not original to the record. I could see it as clearly as a crossword answer, penciled over the wrong one. Felstead had uncovered a false attribution, but in doing so had threatened to unmask Gardner. And Gardner, with subtler hand, had erased him instead. Lewis muttered that it proved nothing. Scholars bickered, reputations were defended with footnotes, not daggers. But I could feel the weight of betrayal in the silence of those cloisters. Knowledge, once found, cannot be unfound. It lingers like a cup that cannot be emptied, however much one tries. I returned to the quadrangle as night closed in. The rain had ceased, but the stones still shone. I paused beneath one arch where ivy clung stubbornly to the wall and looked up at the photograph I carried in my pocket. Felstead and Gardner, younger, their gowns draped carelessly, the empty space between them like a wound. Who had once stood there, I wondered? Whose absence haunted them both? It was then that the pieces began to align, not in clarity but in suggestion. The crossword, the erased word, Grail, the Venetian letter echoing betrayal, the will with its altered dedication, and now the cloister's quiet correction of history. Each fragment bore the same pattern, something written, then erased, a truth glimpsed, then obscured. Felstead had lived with erasures, his work, his loves, his very self, until perhaps he could live with them no longer. The bells began to toll across Oxford, their sound carrying over the rooftops, solemn, unhurried. I stood beneath the arch, listening, my breath visible in the cooling air. I thought of Felstead waiting in that tavern, his eyes on the snug, expecting a reckoning that never came. He had ordered his pint not for thirst, but as a gesture. A cup that would not be emptied, left as testimony. Lewis asked me then what I thought it all meant. I told him little, only that unfinished things cast the longest shadows and that the cloisters of Oxford were filled with such shadows. He frowned, unsatisfied, but said no more. I remained a while longer after he had gone, tracing with my eyes the rain-dark stones, the arches disappearing into darkness. Somewhere within these walls lay the truth of Felstead's unfinished confession, a secret preserved not in the words that survived, but in the ones rubbed out. Gardner had always struck me as a man rehearsed in every gesture, his laugh a little too polished, his disdain a little too fluent, his pauses calculated to appear spontaneous. Yet when I asked to see him again, in his rooms overlooking the Lonsdale quadrangle, there was something different. A weariness in his shoulders, a hesitation, before words reached his lips. He poured a glass of claret, did not drink it, and sat with his hands resting on the table as if waiting for an examination he knew he might fail. "You think I killed him?" he said finally, his eyes fixed on the wine, not on me. I told him I thought many things, but certainty was not among them. He gave a brittle smile and said that certainty was never part of scholarship either. Then it came, not as confession, but as reminiscence. Years ago, he admitted, Felstead had discovered a misattribution in a medieval manuscript, a Venetian poem that, if revealed, would have compromised Gardner's standing. Gardner had persuaded him, gently at first, and then with sharper persuasion, to let the matter rest. In time, Felstead had withdrawn, his reputation diminished, Gardner's preserved, betrayal not by knife or poison, but by silence imposed. He spoke of it almost lightly, as though it were an academic quarrel, an old footnote best forgotten. Yet his eyes betrayed him. A flicker of bitterness, a faint tremor in the hand that still rested near the untouched glass. He admitted he had altered a record once, yes, inserting his name where Felstead's had stood. Nothing criminal, he insisted, merely the way of things in the cloisters. I reminded him that Eleanor Venn had heard the word poison. He shook his head and said she had misheard. He had spoken of portion, some portion of the manuscript debate. Poison was not his word. But I thought of the crossword again, the cup that cannot be emptied, and of the pint left standing. poison portion, words too close to be dismissed. Words, after all, were the tools with which Gardner had carved his survival. Lewis grew restless during the interview, scribbling in his notebook as if the facts could be made to appear by sheer force of ink. But facts were not what Gardner offered, only shadows, recollections, half-truths dressed as academic detachment. When I pressed him further, he sighed. He had not killed Felstead, he said. He had no need. The man was already ruined, already broken by years of exclusion. His death was the final act of a tragedy long rehearsed. If guilt were to be assigned, it was not of blood, but of betrayal. He said it with a composure too smooth to be wholly believed. Yet even in denial, confession lingered. His eyes dropped once to the photograph I had carried with me, the one of the cloister group. He saw the empty space between himself and Felstead, and his voice faltered. He said nothing, only looked away. Later, as Lewis and I left his rooms, the quadrangle empty beneath a low sky, I tried to put his words in order. He had confessed without confessing, admitted theft without calling it theft, betrayal without naming it crime, a quiet confession, so quiet it might almost have gone unheard. Lewis said we had nothing, no evidence, no witnesses, no poison, only old rivalries and academic spite. But I knew better. Some murders are not of the body, but of the soul, enacted slowly over years, until a man is left with nothing but unfinished crosswords and half-erased names. That night I sat at home with a whiskey untouched beside me, the city's bells carrying faintly through the window. I thought of Gardner's hand hovering over the glass he never drank, of Felstead's pint left full in the tavern, of the silence between words spoken and words withheld. Confession, I realized, is rarely loud. It is most often heard in the quiet, where no one wishes to listen. The case, if case it could be called, ended not with a charge sheet or a courtroom, but with silence. Gardner resigned his fellowship quietly, his letter to the college couched in the language of retirement, of making way for younger scholars. No mention of Felstead, no acknowledgement of debts unpaid. Clara Henslow closed her house on Banbury Road, left Oxford without announcement, her curtains drawn for the last time. Simon Rook drank himself into further obscurity, his stories louder as his audience grew smaller. Eleanor Venn returned to her bar, her silence intact, her glass still polished, though never used again. For my part, I wrote no report that could satisfy even the most lenient of magistrates. There was nothing to charge, no poison traced, no evidence laid cleanly on the table, only words half-heard, names erased, clues left unfinished, like a crossword solved in pencil and rubbed away. And yet I knew, as I have always known, that guilt does not vanish because it lacks the courtesy to present itself neatly. I thought often of Felstead in his last hour, the pint before him, ordered not for thirst, but for meaning. The words to the barmaid about cloisters, his eyes on the snug, his body folding forward before the glass was ever raised. He had left his testimony in absence, in gestures half completed, in the silence of what remained undone. A man may live his life unfinished, but his death too can refuse closure. One evening I returned to the Jericho tavern, alone. The place was busier than I cared for, laughter spilling too easily across the tables. I asked for a pint, bitter, and carried it to the corner where Felstead had sat. The same table, the same angle of lamplight falling against the window. I set the glass down before me and did not touch it. The beer glistened faintly, the foam beginning to recede, the surface unbroken. I thought then of the crossword clue, the cup that cannot be emptied. The answer had been Grail, erased. Too perfect, too final. Felstead had known that. He had left it unsolved, as he had left his pint, as he had left his life. It was not completion he sought, but the dignity of remaining unfinished. The grail is never reached, the pint is never drunk, the confession is never fully spoken. Lewis would have mocked me for such thoughts. He preferred his answers sharp-edged, his pints emptied, his crosswords filled. He could not see, or perhaps did not wish to see, that some truths resist solution by their very nature. That ambiguity is not failure, but fidelity to the way things are. I remained there a long time, the glass still untouched, the tavern loud around me. From time to time my eyes drifted to the snug, imagining Felstead leaning forward, Gardiner's voice low, Eleanor polishing glasses at the bar. They were all still there in memory, their shadows cast longer in silence than in speech. When at last I rose to leave, the pint still sat full upon the table. The barmaid moved to clear it, but I stopped her. "Leave it," I said, "just leave it." She gave me a puzzled look, but she obeyed. I stepped out into the night, the damp air pressing against me, the bells of Oxford marking the hour with their usual indifference. Walking back along Walton Street, I lit a cigarette and let the smoke drift upward into the darkness. I thought of Felstead's final words, of the cloisters, of the secrets left unfinished, and I knew then that the case was not closed, nor could it ever be. It would remain in me like that untouched pint, present, unfinished, impossible to empty.